Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most brutal, transformative, and honestly devastating theaters of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire's Caucasus Front. This was a conflict that wouldn't just destroy an army, it would end up forging a nation.
Let's start with a number: 218,878. That is the estimated number of Ottoman soldiers who died on this one single front. And that's not just from combat, that's also from disease and exposure. It's an absolutely staggering figure that gives you a hint of the catastrophe we're about to explore. And hey, while we're getting started, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, share and like my videos. The information in the video is compiled from open sources. Thank you.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at this collapse through 5 key stages. First, we'll see how fragile the empire was before the war even started. Then, we'll look at the brutal war against the elements themselves and the state's iron-fisted policies. From there, we'll untangle the many internal conflicts. And finally, see how a new nation was violently born from these very ashes.
Okay, so to really get what happened, we have to rewind a little bit, because long before the first shots were fired in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was already dealing with some massive crises, both inside and out, that were setting the stage for total disaster.
I mean, just look at the state of things. The sources paint this picture of an empire just coming apart at the seams. Think about it. It's practically bankrupt, with a third of its entire budget just going to pay off debt. Its military is exhausted and demoralized from a long, draining war in Yemen. And on top of all that, it's being ripped apart by nationalist movements from the Balkans all the way to its eastern provinces, where the government barely had any real control to begin with.
But, on the Caucasus Front, the deadliest enemy often wasn't the opposing army. No, it was the unforgiving landscape, the brutal weather, and the diseases that absolutely thrived in those conditions.
And this table, wow, it just lays it all bare. The logistical difference is just night and day. The Ottoman armies were basically stranded, trying to supply themselves using ox carts and mules over these enormous, roadless mountains. Meanwhile, the Russians? They had a whole railway network feeding supplies and troops right to the front. This wasn't just a disadvantage, it was a recipe for catastrophe.
And that logistical failure had absolutely brutal consequences. Just try to put yourself in the shoes of a soldier there. You're already exhausted, and now you're completely cut off by snow in some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. The sources describe how the supply lines just cease to exist. Food, ammunition, basic medical supplies, none of it was getting through. It was a constant, deadly reality. And this brings us to the real silent killer of this front: disease. Typhus, especially, just tore through the ranks. It thrived in the filth and among the weakened, starving bodies of the soldiers. The hospitals were a nightmare, overwhelmed, dirty, without even basic things like clean beds. It's a horrifying fact, but more men died from sickness than from bullets.
So you've got this complete military disaster unfolding, utter chaos. But for the ruling political party back in the capital, the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, they didn't just see a crisis, they saw an opportunity, a chance to radically and ruthlessly reshape the entire empire.
And this right here is so crucial to understanding what happens next. The CUP wasn't just fighting an external war against Russia. They were also waging an internal one. The sources are clear. Their goal was ethno-religious homogenization. In other words, they wanted to use the cover of war to violently purge non-Turkish groups and forge a new, purely Turkish nation-state out of a multi-ethnic empire. And when you look at the timeline drawn from the sources, you can see this horrifying plan unfolding step by step. The state's machinery of violence was first unleashed on its Christian populations, mainly the Armenians, in 1915. But it didn't stop there. By 1916, this policy of deportation and destruction expanded to include certain Kurdish groups that the government saw as potentially disloyal. And if you want a sense of just how ruthless the orders coming from the top were, well, take a look at this. It comes from the account of a Venezuelan officer who was serving in the Ottoman army. He reported this as the direct order received by a provincial governor. While the original telegram itself has never been located, this eyewitness account really captures the absolute brutality of the campaign on the ground.
It's easy to think of this as just Ottomans versus Russians, but that's not the whole story. Not even close. This front was a chaotic, bloody arena of many different overlapping wars, where loyalty was flimsy and violence was just everywhere.
So yeah, on one hand, you have the conventional war, the Ottoman army against the Russian army. But if you peel that layer back, the sources show us a society basically eating itself alive. With the central government collapsing, old tribal feuds just exploded. Warlords and bandits roamed free, preying on villagers. And with all the pressure, some Ottoman soldiers and local tribes just gave up and switched sides. It was an environment of total, violent chaos.
So we've seen total destruction, total collapse, right? But here's the wild paradox. All of that destruction, it wasn't just an ending. In a really tragic, complicated way, it was also a beginning. It became the foundation for something entirely new.
And that leads us to the biggest question of all, the one we really have to tackle to understand the legacy of all this. How on earth does a total collapse, a complete failure, end up fueling the creation of a brand new nation? The answer is, it's complicated, and it's rooted in how the war violently reshaped the land and the people on it.
And here's the answer our sources point to. The Turkish Republic wasn't born from a clean slate. It was built directly on the foundations of this period of collapse. The CUP's brutal policies effectively destroyed the old multi-ethnic empire. By eliminating and deporting non-Turkish communities, they created the demographic reality, a much more homogeneous population that made a unitary nation-state possible.
This final thought from our source material really leaves us with something to grapple with. It's this brutal, almost unbelievable relationship between destruction and creation. And it makes you wonder how the absolute violent collapse of an old world can, through unimaginable suffering, give birth to a new one.